We're going to get started with our next session, which is John James Jacoby. J-Trip is going to be, for those of you who don't know him, is a WordPress core contributor, has worked on the BuddyPress project, has led the BuddyPress and BBPress projects, avid open source contributor, has been donating his time and energy into furthering these projects for many, many years. And he's going to talk to us today about using Unix philosophy as you build big plugins. So, time is yours.
Awesome. Can everybody see enough? Good? Great. So thank you, Ryan. Thank you for having me. Good to see everyone is still here and punctual and awake and full and comfortable. So thank you for making it after lunch. I've been involved with WordPress since about 2006, 7. I didn't sign up for WordPress.org until 2008. I don't usually tell people that, but it took me a few years before I actually made my WordPress.org account. And when I did, I used one of the email addresses that was normally like my spam inbox. And so it was a spam@johnjamesjacoby.com. And when someone actually looked at my account, I think Jen, maybe Matt, looked and said, "Dude, what's with this email address? Why did you use this?" And I was like, I didn't know what I was getting into at the time. I mean, I kind of had an idea, but I wasn't really sure. And so I ended up changing my email address very quickly after that. Obviously, when someone recognizes it and says so, you usually change it relatively quick. But since then, I have evolved my WordPress career trail, as we will call it, that may be littered with the occasional headstone or dysentery situation. To being to a point where I consider myself a industry-sponsored WordPress professional, which means that I am sponsored by very generous folks who allow me to work on WordPress core, be a site admin for WordPress.org and some of the other properties that are there, BuddyPress and BBPress.org. Had a brief stint with Automatic working on WordPress.com, Jetpack, VIP, and on. And so I'll take my moment to thank Pagely and Pantheon for helping me get here today, of which there are and will be, several others as they go. But for the most part, they have been very generous with their time and support to allow me to be here. So I appreciate that very much. Most of you may occasionally know me as the BuddyPress guy, and I'm okay with that. That is generally where people recognize me the most as a passion project of mine. But throughout the years and the history of BuddyPress, which Josh and I have talked about even relatively recently, so it's fresh on my mind, is a very large plugin at LoopConf last year. I talked about 2 years ago now, right? Thanks to a hurricane. I talked about BuddyPress and big plugins like BuddyPress and BBPress and Jetpack. And when it comes to the Unix philosophy of these things, we would traditionally call these plugins monolithic, because they are big and they have lots of pieces and they are grouped together as one big project. BBPress also, right? I mean, can you tell that I'm a very minimalist designer, because they're just a color swap for each other. They used to do that with like He-Man guys and G.I. Joes and toys, right? It was like the exact same toy, but it was just a different color paint on the thing. So there's that. But you may not know that I've got a bunch of other really tiny open source projects on GitHub through a tiny little .org of my own called Stutter. One, because I will occasionally do so it's taken me up to my adult life to not have a stutter. But also because there are tiny other little plugins and ideas and things that come up that don't deserve a monolithic approach to things. And in doing this as an exercise for myself as a developer and an engineer, and occasionally trying to educate and share people with what I've learned, that has resulted in 50 or so tiny, weird little plugins that are sort of skunkworks, sort of experimental, that do fun and interesting little things. So check those out too. And I'm not really going to be talking about a lot of them today, but there's a lot of neat examples of stuff if you want to go check them out on GitHub. Stutter with 3 T's. So where I live in a small rural town in Wisconsin, there's not a lot of technology. Imagine that. It's 4,000 people that live there. Ironically enough, though, one of the friends of mine that I've gotten to know very well Used to work at a place that most of you may have heard of but would never recognize, called the Long Now Foundation. So they're in San Francisco, big deal, really cool. Him and his partner and their 3 kids moved to East Troy, Wisconsin. And so we share an office space together. He worked there for a number of years, worked remote for a very long time. They're the group that put the Rosetta disk with all of the world's languages on the Comet as it flew by. Really cool stuff. And so he was helping do that from rural Wisconsin in the middle of nowhere. And in getting to know each other and having some overlap with tech and knowing the same people, he's a Django developer, Python, Django, his whole career. And him touching WordPress was like, well, okay, like I'll go play with WordPress for a while, or we'll build a website with whatever, but always Python and Django. And so eventually, he exited the Long Now and worked with a local group, 2 other brothers and their family, and they're working on a piece of software called Milker, basically big data for dairies. There is a whole dairy over IP. They have Fitbits for cows. Not even joking. It's amazing. The software is incredible, and they're building it with Django and lots of other little modules and plugins to make this piece of software work. And in the years of knowing these guys and the musings at the coffee shop and hanging out and having beer, long story short, my friend Justin gets us to this. WordPress is the Windows of the web. And at first I was like, oh. And then I was like, you're kind of right. In like the best possible way, where WordPress is sort of the culmination of all of our ideas and thoughts and tools to make publishing to the web literally as easy as it could possibly be. And that made it mass marketable in a way. It made it digestible and easy for people to do what they need to do on the web back when it wasn't that simple to do. Now, today, we think of this differently, especially in the context of like Unix philosophies for WordPress development or plugin development. But I found it really interesting that from the actual Unix web page, if you read this snippet that is straight from the home page, if you replace the word Unix with WordPress, there are some overlap. There are some similarities here between the way that WordPress works and how it's the culmination of lots of open source projects and years worth of work. And there are lots of companies and businesses and individuals and foundations coming together to make a one piece of software great for all of the rest of us, but the rest of the world as well. And for me, that doesn't necessarily mean .org. That includes WordPress.com. That includes blog.com, which I think still uses WordPress. There are a bunch of other services and things that use or rely on WordPress that are in kind of unique and crazy ways, not unlike Unix as a piece of software and operating system we would look at today. And so we start off with the creators, right, the originators of what we have come to know and love. And so this is where I'll quickly talk about some of the individuals whose snippets and quotes that I'm going to be sharing with you today, but also generally how I think they kind of still apply to what we do with WordPress core, plugins, our services, ourselves, sort of our own paths with what it is that we enjoy doing. So Ken Thompson, Dennis Ritchie. For Doug McElroy, I always do it wrong every time. It's like photography. So his quote, I thought, is the one that we hear probably the most commonly for ourselves. Like we talk about this, like the real hero of programming is the one who writes negative code. The pink. You want to see pink in your diffs. You don't want to see green. If you can take the code away and make it simpler, but still make it work better, generally, you are the person who has like done everyone around you like the biggest possible service. By writing more code and building more things, you're only producing like more work for people to do. Also, Eric S. Raymond, ESR, is anyone that might know him from, but Matt has said some version of this at some point throughout all of my relationship with him or with Automatic or WordPress is when you have enough people, you can kind of get anything done. Bugs start to be very simple to fix. We start to share the pain of having release leads. We start to branch across different areas of expertise and different approaches towards things. And one of the things that struck me with reading this, and Bugs being shallow, and maybe some of you that I've sort of shared some of pre-filtered some of my thoughts with while we've been here, is it reminds me of why Matt likes jazz, is that things sort of ebb and flow. Someone is the lead for a while and has a solo, and everyone follows. And then WordPress goes in a different direction, and we focus on post types and APIs, and then we have a jam session on that for a while. And then somebody exits or somebody leaves, and we say, oh, you're really great with JavaScript. Come and rewrite all of media because we know that we don't like it. And someone comes and prioritizes and focuses on media for a year or two, and then they go away. And then somebody else comes in and says, we need to work on the REST API. And a whole group of people jam on the REST API for a really long time. That is jazz. That is exactly how that works. And so when you consider sort of our benevolent dictator leadership or lack thereof or whatever, it's very jazz-like. All of WordPress and what we do. You have the opportunity to help build and influence any of these things however you want. And so there's a lot of that happens with open source in general, but also sort of directly applies to our Unix philosophies in a way. And then the obligatory XKCD. I will leave it up here for a few seconds for everyone to kind of grok and read. Really, the last slide is the funny one, is sort of the most important, which is that, you can spend a lot of time doing a lot of things and writing a lot of documentation and everything else. But eventually, if you go too simple, you write code that does nothing. It just filters nothing, it runs through nothing, and you've kind of accomplished a whole lot of nothing. So I'm going to quick drill through what are kind of the 4 fundamental Unix philosophies, and I also don't want to read TV to you because that seems sort of terrible. Y'all can read, and so you can kind of look at it and figure it out. But my takeaway I'll give you my takeaway from pretty much most of what these are. So I'm going to drill through some, and then we'll talk about what they are. And so make each program do one thing well, which is, ironically enough, not something that WordPress really does. It does do one thing very well, but then we all know and love WordPress for kind of doing everything else acceptably well also. If it's through plugins, if it's through whatever else. I mean, WordPress has posts and taxonomies and pages and RSS and media. But in order to make WordPress do any one of these things very well, you need a relatively awesome web host for the time that you end up on Hacker News and it wants to, you get 1 million hits and everything, goes to heck. So the other part of this is that we don't really go back and build something totally afresh, as would be one of the Unix philosophies here. We do iterate a lot on the same thing that we've had for a very long time. It doesn't matter if it's post types or comments or multi-site or users or anything else. It's very difficult to build afresh. Now, some things we kind of have. The media, for example, just brand new media. One release, brand new media. Now it's a modal, now it's got all this stuff. And so that will happen occasionally. And if something becomes too afresh, like composer support or something else, you're sort of 2 clicks too far away from where everybody's comfort level is with WordPress and how we iterate on things. This is probably one of my favorite, and they're a little lengthy, but get the output of every program needs to understand what might be happening after it. There are a lot of plugins that do this very poorly. There are some plugins that do this very well. But the reality is that everyone is running some interconnected combination of WordPress plugins and themes. They're different every time. And so that's fun for us because you never know what you're going to get. But it also makes it really difficult as a plugin developer or a theme developer because you don't know what the environment is. You don't know what plugins are running. You don't know what theme or child theme they may have. Comments are on or off. Post type support. Can users log in? Open registration. Caching. What is it? You don't know. WordPress tries to encapsulate all of that for you, that complexity, so that you don't have to think about all that. But as a developer, as sort of a plugin artisan, you have to understand the environment that you're working with, and you have to be ready for any one of those things, those assumptions, those decisions that you make to not be true. Because you can filter them, have actions, some other plugin can conflict. One of the things I like to talk about quite a bit is custom post types and our metadata storage. If 2 post types use event for a post type, but they use different metadata keys, and you decide you don't like Sugar Calendar, but you want to go for Event Calendar Pro, and they both use event for a post type storage, they'll show up in your list table as events, but none of the data will be right. And so we have no interoperability when it comes to some of these types of decisions that we make. And so there can be weird user problems. And as a developer, it's your responsibility to look for those things. You don't usually, because it's a lot of added complexity, but that is where we are still with a lot of this stuff. And so one of my favorites is trying something early, essentially prototyping. Build something that you are able to actually use, and then use it like as quickly as possible. It sounds kind of silly that this is even a thing that you have to consider, but there is far too often that something is built and sits on the shelf, or a feature gets drawn out for so long that you sort of forget why you're working on it anymore. Guilty of that with some BuddyPress stuff over the 10 years that we've been working on it. And so it's you have to be willing to scrap it or start something afresh if for some reason your approach actually isn't working. And then this is sort of a little hard for me, I guess, but my take on this particular philosophy is, and especially with open source, is maybe a little bit different, because the preference to trying to use a tool to solve a problem means that for every tool that we end up with, generally someone is not getting an education about what that tool is supposed to be doing. And a big part of open source development is learning how things work and educating yourself. And so once we automate too much stuff, then the barrier for entry gets really, really high. And so it's nice to know how unit tests work, and it's nice to know how functions work, and it's nice to know how all that gets set up, and it's nice to trust that Travis runs against all these versions. But once somebody does that, nobody has to do that usually again. And so if you're not in the trenches writing debug code and writing tests for things and understanding how that whole thing works, it's nice to not have to, but it does level you up if you do know. And so there is some give and take, I think, that happens when it comes to relying on some sort of external tools for things. And so along the lines of some of the quotes and sort of nice thoughts that I was coming across, is sort of similar to the culmination of what we end up with WordPress, the same way that we end up with Unix, is that no one individual feature or bundled software, TinyMCE, SimplePy, requests. WordPress comes with these things built in. They're all open source and GPL compatible, but WordPress packages them all up, calls it WordPress, and gives it to everybody to use. And so no one of those things, TinyMCE is pretty great. I know we like to hate it, but it's not a bad piece of software for the web. No one of them by itself is all that super powerful, but together they suddenly become really powerful. And so the Unix philosophy takes this a little bit of a step further, and you end up with just a command like cat, or like a thing like a pipe. And suddenly it's like amazing. Like once you realize how it works, you're like, oh, why have I never been doing it this way before? But certain things like a metadata API or a proper settings API or the REST API can make really complex things suddenly happen like very, very quickly and easily. And so we try really hard to do these things, but they do have to be a part of your being, your philosophy. You have to understand the reason why you're doing some of this stuff. And so the too long didn't read is do one thing and do it well. If you can isolate an idea boil it down into the broth and say, this is what the thing is that we're trying to accomplish, then you sort of end up like Amazon Web Services. You end up with all these like micro things that do one thing and that you can rely on to do something very well. And the second that one thing needs to become a different thing, now you have a new thing. This old thing doesn't become both things. You need another thing. And that, again, is the opposite usually happens with WordPress plugins and even WordPress core to a certain degree. Like if we were going to start parsing XML, we would bring in some complete XML parsing API to help us, even though we only need to parse, one specific thing. SVGs would be a good example. Do we use cases if we want to parse SVGs? It's just XML. It's kind of like HTML. But if we want to make sure that SVGs are secure, then how do we parse those to make sure that we're only getting what we want and not getting the cruft that we don't? The way to do it is usually to pull in some tool that does one thing really well, even though it could do other things. We only need it to do SVGs when you want to use them as your app icon or your site icon or something else. So guilty of breaking this rule a little bit with BuddyPress, honestly, where BuddyPress is a piece of software, does one thing very well, but it also does 9 things mostly okay. And then it will do, 100 other things, relatively okay, acceptably, but it's not always the right thing for everybody. And so there's a lot of lessons, I think, even as I would consider myself a relatively seasoned engineer and software developer, but in the process of learning how WordPress works and plugins work and where to go and what to do and what the future looks like, BuddyPress definitely changed. It changed shape. It morphed. It Pokemon itself to several different levels until it became what it is today. So I think there's a lot to take away from that. And so there are 17 other sort of rules that some Unix contributors have come up with. I will not bore you with all 17 of them, although they are all worth reading or looking at or educating yourself on. So I will give you some of my favorites. And so these generally apply to almost everything that you, I think, in my opinion, should be doing when it comes to plugin development, theme development, core contributions, whatever your du jour would be for what you are an expert or specialize in. And I've tried to have somewhat relative screenshots so you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. But the idea with having a simple program kind of just means that it's okay if you want to have 10 plugins to accomplish whatever the end result is that you're going for. To a certain extent, WordPress.com had 100 separate tiny little plugins that did different things because they were purpose-built to solve one problem. HTML emails. Every time that you get an email from WordPress.com or Jetpack that an HTML email comes in, 1, I helped do that. 2, that's all it does. There's no reason for it to do anything else or more. We can theme it, we can style it, there's some stuff that you expect, but for the most part, all it does is just wrap up your email text, whatever email might come from WordPress, give it a fancy header footer, make sure there's a text alternative, do all the stuff that we need to make it work correctly, and then send off an HTML email. So that's where I think plugins become really pretty. Originally, BuddyPress was a separate set of plugins. Wasn't always a monolith. It started off as a bunch of separate things. And it became a packaging problem, because how do you get everyone friends and activity streams and the core of it, and how do you deliver this to people? And so maybe today it's a little bit easier, and there are plugins like Easy Digital Downloads or WooCommerce that come with a core, and then you have add-ons. The add-on model is very popular now. Maybe we could have done that with BuddyPress, but had we done it 10 years ago, no one really knew what to do with that, because that wasn't really where everyone's heads were at. That wasn't how WordPress and the add-on model worked. And so it didn't seem right. So we packaged it all up together. Now that we've packaged it all up together, tearing it back apart becomes very, very difficult. And so it is what it is now. And if we do decide that we want to ever do anything different again later, it is likely that we might have to rebuild something or package something up smaller that might be compatible but might not be the same. The rule of clarity, and this is something that I had a hard time putting into words, but reading somebody else's words helped me verbalize, is that we write code for each other. And occasionally we will write code for machines, but we do write it so that we can have other people help us continue to improve it. And so what that means is writing codes or writing functions and classes and things, not only that are documented, documentation is important, but that we use the right words and the right verbs and the right patterns and the right structure to make sure that someone can read this and go, I _ know _ what _ that _ does. Having some progression is really helpful. And I think when you're starting off learning how to write software and how to read software, that these are little patterns and things that you have to learn from surrounding behaviors and etiquette. When you're first learning what, this equals true, this equals false, your mind is blown, but eventually you realize that this underscores some other thing becomes a thing that people need in order to read and write code. So the rule of clarity, I think, for me, ends up being really important. I guess it's possible to also be over clear and over describe something, but I really try with everything that it is that I'm open sourcing for there to be some clarity of what it is that I'm writing. The next one is the rule of composition. And so, and this sort of goes back to what we're talking about with plugins that work well with each other. My example here is BuddyPress and BBPress. Although they're two monolithic plugins, very large plugins, when they are both active, they know how to talk to each other. You can do this intentionally like they do, which means that BuddyPress groups can now have forums per group. That's cool. But you may have a plugin that brings in like select2 or chosen, like a JavaScript library. But some other plugin may also include select2 because it doesn't come with WordPress core. So you need to be aware that they might have it, and you might have it, and they might have styling, and they might have styling. Which one wins? How do you yield, and why? You have to learn. You have to check them out. But you should design with some idea of what some other plugin is trying to do, and whether or not you want to be the bully and push them out, or you want to yield and let them win. This one is where we talk about BuddyPress again. Developers should avoid writing big programs. No, it's a movie, but it's, you know. Sorry. Developers should design programs that build on top of users' existing knowledge. And so if you're going to write a plugin, it gets really difficult with something like BuddyPress to do that, because there's a lot that we know about, you know, a social network or even in Amazon. I like to think that Amazon is somewhat of a social network. We don't have profiles or activity streams or whatever else, but we do have feedback. We do have comments for the most part on things that you buy. You've got shopping carts and lists and wish lists where you can see somebody else's wish list items, and you can buy them a thing off of it if you want to, and they will eventually thank you for that probably. So there is some element there. But with WordPress, we're pretty lucky in having WP admin as like the general portal for most people's interaction with WordPress. And it has given us a love it or hate it sort of paradigm of, you know, some navigation on the left, the toolbar on the top, the title, some content. People generally know how that works and what to expect. What happens theme side and what you choose to do with the REST API and everything else is obviously an unlimited number of things that you can do there. But it's important that the things and the decisions, things you do and the decisions you make are going to be the most well-received if you play off of what people already know. A really good place where this happens a lot in a really, well, if you do this really well, you don't know. You don't see it because it's done so well that it's invisible to you. Most people will recognize when it happens poorly. You know, if you drill a hole in a spoon, you will not be able to, you know, spoon soup. It'll just all fall out. You'll recognize when it's bad, but it's hard to recognize when it's good. Video game design is one of those areas where, like, a really good video game is amazing. They'll go on to have accolades, and everyone will love them 30 years later because it's amazing. And then you'll have really crappy video games that might have been good, but they didn't do a good job of building on the experiences that users or players would have had before. Developers should design programs that do not print unnecessary output. This isn't my fault. Why? Why do we need to know this? It's going to keep going for a really long time. I don't know. Don't do it. I mean, like, there's a fine line. Like, so this probably matters to some people. I know, right? Yeah. But it matters to some. There are people that look at this and go, of course, I need to know that these 10,000 things are here. Seems a little superfluous and unnecessary to me for my particular tastes. But it probably does matter to someone. I guess it matters when there's an error. Show me that. Don't show me all this. Developers should value developer time over machine time. Because there will be more machines, and it just gets cheaper. And so you can farm out processing wherever you need to go. You can have more servers. One of the first conversations that I had with Matt when we were talking about connecting WordPresses together, talking about, well, it was actually BuddyPress sort of siloed communities together. and talking about how you connect them together and how you put together some sort of distribution network and how you get people's WordPresses to talk to other people's WordPresses. And we kind of had Ping-O-Matic, and we kind of had some open web stuff with trackbacks. How do you actually connect? This was how do you connect all these WordPresses together in a distributed way? And we've got all these hosting companies and WordPress installations, and you don't know what plugins they've got running or whatever else. And so my response to that was that we needed a hub. We needed some place, in my mind, api.wordpress.org, where you can see what sites you've connected to, what sites you have an account on. Even though they're all distributed, you end up needing some place in the middle where they all hook up to. That idea blossomed into what we know is Jetpack at this point today. But Matt's response to this was, well, assume unlimited resources. Like if this was a thing that you wanted to build and you wanted to do and wanted to implement and connect WordPress to WordPress to WordPress a million times over for every user all around the world, how do you do that? Well, in order to do that, you need to not care so much about the machine time. Assume that you can solve that problem. The developer time, how many years is this going to take? How many bodies is this going to take? What technology do we need to build in order to make this work and connect all of these infinite computing resources together? And then developers should prototype software before polishing it. And this is what we did with bbpress.org. When we relaunched bbpress as a plugin, it was originally a standalone piece of software like WordPress was. We re-architected it into being a plugin. It ran on bbpress.org before anyone else could see it. We moved over 400,000 posts. It was a plugin. It was running an updated version of WordPress. And we were prototyping it. Is this viable? Does it perform better? It didn't, but we fixed that. And that was the reason that prototyping was valuable for us, is we were able to polish it and continue doing so, from 2010 until today, to make it work better and be better and everything else. And so part of our process is to be able to say, okay, we built this thing, now go. It's out. What does it do? How does it react? How do people like it? Polish it up, ship it. And then extensibility, and we're talking about the add-on model. WooCommerce, to me, does this really, really well. It is a core product that does one thing really well. It does other things really well, too. But then it has a whole ecosystem of things that it can also do as a result of it being extremely flexible. You have to build that flexibility in. You have to understand where those points need to come from. But WooCommerce is a great example of something that is highly, highly extensible. And so, 2 final quotes. And this one is interesting to me because I'd been saying this for a long time in like the wrong way, like the negative way, like the curmudgeon-y way. But the takeaway for me is very similar to WordPress's life cycle. Is in the beginning it wasn't real great. And it was an idea, and it was a fork of B2, and there was some stuff that needed to get done and fixed, and eventually we all really came to enjoy it, kind of almost as, even though it was like the best thing at the time, it was still very bad. It was just, you can see the potential in something, and you can get people excited about it, and get people ramped up about it, and turn it into something that is good or better than the sum of all of us that help make it. And so, my final quote from me is that we are all really terrible at communicating all this stuff. We are the lossiest compression algorithm that there is. Everything that comes into me comes out totally different than it will come out from all of you. And so if you are interested in the philosophy behind engineering, software development, how Unix was invented and created, the philosophies behind the founders of that, on up to wherever we are today, you should just check it out. There are tons of materials and books. Talk to people that have been in it. Talk to people that know some of these guys, and just learn about the philosophies of writing software, because it's really fascinating stuff. Like a lot of these problems or rules and guides, people knew this stuff before we were born. They had already solved these problems, and we resolve them again and again and again. So thank you for your time.